July 7, 2025. The morning on global financial markets began like any other. The Dow Jones inched up slightly. The US dollar held steady against the euro. Oil prices ticked higher following news about OPEC's reserve levels. But then, at exactly 8:12 a.m. Washington time, a short message on the official White House account sent shockwaves through the world. President Donald J. Trump confirmed a 50% tariff on all copper products imported in the United States, effective immediately, within the week. No press conference, no trade summit, no prior warning. Just one cold, calculated command. Classic Trump, fast, forceful, and unapologetic. The markets reacted instantly and violently. Copper futures for September deliveries surged 11% in under an hour. American tech and energy companies, which rely heavily on copper for wiring, chips, and charging stations, saw their stock prices tumble. A wave of confusion and panic swept across the globe. What was really going on? No one expected the word copper, seemingly a dry, technical commodity, to become the epicenter of a historic political and trade clash. But in hindsight, this move was anything but random. Since winning his second term, Donald Trump had been carefully laying the groundwork to ignite a new generation metal war. Steel, aluminum, lumber, and now copper had all been added to the tariff list under Section 232 of the National Security Act. But unlike previous rounds, this time the target wasn't just traditional rivals like China. Even the United States' closest allies, like Canada, weren't spared from the fallout. Copper, that humble red metal, might not get mentioned in major press briefings, but it's the lifeblood of modern industry. From electric vehicles to data centers, from power lines to substations, everything runs on copper. And when Trump chose copper as his opening shot, no one doubted his intent. This wasn't just a trade policy, it was a symbolic strike, aimed straight at the heart of the global supply chain. And in that supply chain, one name stands out: Canada. America's closest partner, its neighbor to the north, and one of the most vital links in the metal industry, from mining and refining to export. But now, that very name is caught in a chess game unlike any before. Is Canada playing a strategic role, or has it simply become a pawn on the board? Donald Trump is moving with an iron hand. With the copper tariff decision, Donald Trump didn't just strike at a weak point in China's supply chain. He delivered a surprise blow to America's closest neighbor and trusted partner, Canada. While not the largest copper exporter to the US, Canada plays an irreplaceable role in the supply network. From ore extraction in British Columbia to shipping it to Asia for refining, then back to North America in the form of cables, sheets, electronic components, and industrial parts. What once seemed like a seamless circle has now been severed at its final link. The impact was immediate and cascading. By imposing tariffs on finished copper imports, the entire value chain, built on the stability of the USMCA agreement, began to tremble. Not only did Canadian manufacturers take a hit, but American factories relying on low-cost components were thrown into turmoil. Yet what surprised many observers the most was Ottawa's response: restrained, almost resigned, at least on the surface. Back in June, the Canadian government had voluntarily withdrawn its digital services tax, a levy worth over 1 billion Canadian dollars annually, in what was seen as a goodwill gesture aimed at easing tensions. But instead of reciprocating, the White House doubled down. Copper wasn't the end. A new wave of threats followed, including a potential 200% tariff on pharmaceuticals and medical equipment from Canada, a sector deeply tied to public welfare and the country's cherished universal health care system. With tensions escalating by the day, Prime Minister Mark Carney found himself in the toughest position since taking office. A seasoned economist and former governor of the Bank of England, Carney understands numbers better than most. But this time, the issue wasn't just economic, it was about identity and trust. If he backed down, Carney risked being seen as weak, undermining Canada's national sovereignty. But if he struck back, the danger of losing Canada's hard-won place in the North American trade order was very real, an order painstakingly renegotiated after the chaos of USMCA. And as faith in the shared rules began to erode, he was forced to consider options outside the traditional trade playbook. Private discussions began to surface within the Canadian cabinet. Could a new proposal be crafted, one that transcended trade entirely? Perhaps a long-term security and defense agreement in exchange for a rollback of America's punitive tariffs, a form of strategic barter between two neighboring nations. But tragically, every message sent to the White House was met with silence. According to multiple insider sources, Washington's quiet wasn't due to indifference, but part of a calculated strategy: push Canada to its breaking point, forcing it to choose between continued dependence or a breakaway from the US trade orbit. And in that context, Mark Carney made a pivotal decision to draw a red line. July 21st, a deadline unilaterally set by Canada as the cutoff for reaching a new deal with the US, would mark a turning point. If no agreement was reached by then, Ottawa would launch a full-scale retaliation. No more goodwill. No more open negotiations. Only one question would remain. In this game of brinkmanship, who will blink first? Mark Carney is not your typical politician. He's not one for media sparring, nor does he rely on flowery rhetoric to mask hard truths. Instead, he's the kind of leader who deals in numbers, in financial models, and equations that reflect economic realities with cold precision. But now, all the experience of a former governor of the Bank of England is being put to the test by a chessboard that no longer plays by financial logic, but by the volatile currents of political emotion. As July 21st draws closer, the pressure on Carney intensifies, not just from Washington, but from within Canada itself. Industrial provinces like Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta are raising red flags. Production is stalling, orders are drying up, jobs are vanishing. The National Federation of Labor is turning up the heat. Export businesses are threatening to pull investment unless there's a clear commitment to trade stability. The public is beginning to doubt the government's negotiating ability. Carney knows, if he lets the deadline pass without securing a deal, trust will collapse. Not just from abroad, but from his own people. That's why a counteroffensive is being quietly prepared. In the worst-case scenario, if Washington continues its silence or flat-out refuses to engage, Canada will trigger a sweeping retaliation package, reimposing tariffs on more than $125 billion worth of U.S. goods, from agriculture and steel to tech. At the same time, Ottawa is discreetly reaching out to European and Asian allies, increasingly vital trade partners, to form a new economic buffer zone, easing Canada's dependence on the US market. But there's no need to wait for July 21st. The pressure is already seeping into every corner of the economy. And one of the places feeling it the most is the industrial heart of the country, Canada's auto sector. For the people of Windsor and Oshawa, this is no longer an abstract issue. Every policy, every tweet from the White House could spell the end of a production line, a mortgage payment, or a family dinner paid for by wages earned on the factory floor. Now, as tariff walls rise and supply chains snap, the wound is no longer festering quietly. It's bleeding. Since early 2025, Canada's auto plants had already begun to feel the first tremors. But it wasn't until March, when the US officially slapped a 25% tariff on vehicles assembled in Canada, excluding a handful of made-in-USA parts, that the real earthquake struck. In Windsor, once proudly known as the automotive capital of Canada, production lines now run at a crawl. Nearly half the workers have been placed on rotating furloughs, that have many relying on temporary government support just to get by. Streets that once echoed with the rumble of delivery trucks and shift change whistles have fallen eerily silent, like a winter that refuses to end. Major automakers like Ford Canada, General Motors, and Stellantis, once living proof of the deep economic bond between the US and Canada, have now become casualties of that very bond unraveling. Over 85% of vehicles built in Canada are exported to the US, but these aren't simple one-way shipments. In reality, a single car might cross the US-Canada border 6 or 7 times before it's finished. Components manufactured in Michigan travel to Ontario, get assembled in Windsor, return to Ohio for electrical systems, and then head back to Canada for final inspection and export. It's a complex but efficient web, and one that proves frighteningly fragile when one side unilaterally decides to change the rules. The impact goes beyond layoffs and slowdowns. It delivers a crushing blow to Canada's green transition plan. Under new federal mandates, by 2026, at least 20% of vehicles sold in Canada must be electric or hybrid. But currently that figure hovers at just 8%. And now, as car makers scramble to absorb the shock of new tariffs, they're left with little room to invest in new technology, charging infrastructure, or battery supply chains. One Stellantis executive put it bluntly: without support, we won't just miss our green targets, we could see production drop by 40% next year. The frustration isn't just in the numbers, it's in the growing sense of abandonment. Canadians are asking, if the North American alliance can't protect the supply chain, then what's the point? And if every morning they wake up wondering what new tariff or sanction Washington might impose today, where is the trust between neighboring nations? Yet here lies the paradox. While Canada bears the immediate pain, even within the United States, the very origin of these decisions, the blowback is beginning to heat up. Tariffs meant to protect domestic manufacturing? Sounds reasonable. But in practice, it's American consumers, small businesses, and workers who are first to feel the squeeze. Because in today's hyper-connected world, punitive measures are no longer one-way weapons. They're a stick with two sharp ends. When President Donald Trump declared that the new tariffs were meant to revive American industry, many applauded. The slogan, emotional and proud, quickly echoed across conservative media channels. But behind the cheers and confident chest thumping, a much harsher reality began to emerge. In just 3 months, aluminum prices in the Midwest, home to many processing plants, surged by over 60%. Coca-Cola, a symbol of American consumer culture, threatened to switch from aluminum cans to plastic bottles due to soaring costs. In construction, the average price of a new home jumped by $22,000 purely because of rising material costs. A staggering figure in a country where over 100 million people already can't afford to buy a home, and cars were no exception. Automakers like Ford and Chevrolet were forced to raise retail prices by 15 to 20%, or about $6,000 per vehicle, pushing the dream of car ownership even further out of reach for the middle class. Small businesses, the backbone of the US economy, were hit hardest. Unlike major corporations, they couldn't stockpile inventory. A shoe importer like Deer Stags, with 98% of its products coming from China, suddenly had to pay a 16% tariff the moment its shipments arrived at port. Logistics companies in Texas found themselves in crisis as warehousing costs spiked, while contracts signed the year before locked them into outdated pricing. Meanwhile, giants like Walmart, which had stockpiled goods back in 2024, weathered the storm and even expanded their market share. The tariff war, intended to punish foreign competitors, ended up choking the weakest links inside America itself. The American working class began to feel betrayed. They had believed that tough policies would bring jobs back home, but what they saw instead were soaring prices, stagnant wages, and factory doors still closing. As debates raged on in Washington, in small towns across Pennsylvania and Ohio, people could only wonder, are we being left behind? And while America was still tangled in its internal struggle, Canada, the supposed victim in all this, began to strike back, not through fiery declarations or rhetorical battles, but with quiet, deliberate action in subtle structural changes few noticed at first. A silent counterattack is beginning to take shape. No bombastic speeches, no threats of public retaliation, no press conferences condemning the White House. Canada's response to the US tariffs, so starkly different from Donald Trump's hardline image, is precisely what made the world start paying attention. Instead of striking back with bold declarations, Ottawa quietly shifted its strategy. In June, Schneider Electric announced the expansion of its factory in Quebec, doubling domestic production capacity. Production lines that once relied on imported copper or components from the US have now pivoted to self-sufficiency. Exports to the US have dropped sharply, but more notably, exports to Europe and Asia have increased by 6%, the highest level in a decade. This shift isn't limited to heavy industry. Even the energy sector, a long-standing pillar of US-Canada relations, has begun to move. Ontario, which supplies electricity to tens of millions of people in the northeastern US, is considering a new export tariff. In a brief but pointed statement, an energy official said, "If trade is no longer viewed as mutually beneficial, there's no reason for us to keep sacrificing domestic stability for an external market." Essential materials like chlorine, softwood, and refined aluminum, most of which originate from Canada, are now under tighter control. Rather than targeting American goods already on the shelves, Ottawa has chosen to strike at the very foundations the U.S. relies on every day. This is no longer a knee-jerk reaction. It's a strategic restructuring from within. While American media continue to debate right and wrong, Canada has begun quietly stepping back from disadvantageous structures. A calculated retreat, but not to surrender. It's to choose a new position. And when that move happens in silence, it becomes far more unsettling than any declaration of war. Because at some point, silence stops being tolerance. It becomes the final warning. And from that atmosphere, tense, quiet as a drawn bowstring, one question stands out clearer than ever. Who will blink first? Who will concede or make a misstep in a game that's reached its final stage? The last battle needs no gunfire, but its consequences may echo long after all the statements have faded. July 9th, Washington. Donald Trump stepped off Marine One saying nothing, offering only his usual wave. But inside the White House, his advisors had already finalized the next phase, a list of Canadian goods lined up for potential new tariffs, including pharmaceuticals, chemicals, and electronics, ready to be unleashed if Ottawa refused to yield. At the same time in Ottawa, Mark Carney was locked in a closed-door meeting with his cabinet. Their counter-strategy had been planned down to the smallest detail. Every U.S. tariff would be met with a proportional response, quiet, measured, but firm. A kind of trade Cold War was taking shape. No gunfire, no formal declaration, yet silently affecting millions of workers, every household, every dinner table, every night's sleep. July 21st, the red line Carney had drawn was drawing near. And what made this standoff truly unsettling wasn't its volume, it was the silence. No one knew what would happen when the clock struck midnight. A surprise breakthrough? An all-out tariff war? Or perhaps just the quiet unraveling of nearly 30 years of trust built under the framework of North American trade? Canadians had already begun responding in their own way. They stopped buying American wine. Vacation bookings to Florida were canceled en masse. Many families began considering selling their U.S. real estate, and the once muted call to buy local had transformed into a survival imperative. On the other side of the border, the U.S. was beginning to feel the ripples too, but no one was backing down. Because the question was no longer who's right or wrong, it was who can hold out longer in a world fracturing under protectionism and overinflated national egos. And as two countdown clocks, one in Washington, the other in Ottawa, ticked in sync toward their shared moment of reckoning, the world could only watch. Not to root for either side, but to see if anyone had the courage to blink before it all went too far. The Second Metal War is no longer just a tariff dispute. It has gone beyond economics, becoming a symbol of a shifting world order, one where trade is no longer built on cooperation and trust, but on pressure, threats, and raw power. Canada now stands at a historic crossroads, to bow down or to stand tall. And the United States, a nation that once led the world with vision and generosity, may now be wounding its own foundation with reckless acts of punishment. At a time when the world is still struggling to regain stability after the pandemic and the supply chain crisis, what we need is not another battle, whether it's over steel, copper, or shouting matches. What we need is understanding, patience, and the courage to end the fight before it's too late. If you found this story thought-provoking, make sure to subscribe to Soy Soy TV to stay with us through in-depth analysis, unique perspectives, and reports that don't just inform, but inspire you to see the world with greater clarity and fairness. We'll see you in the next video.